In the previous chapter, we looked at security policy, but now we have to take the good words of policy and turn them into action. This is where implementing security policies is important. When we implement policy, what we're really doing is trying to implement the intent or the purpose of the policy. The idea is that policy was there to provide direction. The implementation is how to reach the goal of policy, the direction of it. Now we interpret, or we could say we implement policy through various techniques. For example, procedures, baselines, standards, and guidelines. Procedures are really quite simply the actions taken to implement policy. We can quite often say that a procedure is the mandated steps and tasks that a person must follow. If you want to set up a new user, this is how you do it. If you want to set up remote access or a new computer, this is how you do it. The steps and tasks taken so that that new user is set up in a way that would be compliant with the intent of policy to protect the assets of the organization. It's important, we said, mandated or required. A procedure should not be something which is, well, yeah, follow it if you like, it's a good idea. No, it is the way that's mandated for us to follow. Now, there's some very good advantages to procedures. If I follow the procedures, such as setting up a new user, that new user will be set up consistently each time. Each one of our users, each one of our administrators will ensure that they follow that procedure so things can be done consistently and can be audited to see if we're not following that procedure. It also therefore sets the benchmark for what is acceptable or what's an unacceptable behavior. It allows us to compare the real to the intended, and in that way gives us a benchmark to measure against. It helps us to ensure regulatory compliance, and it supports the ability to audit or review what is being done. Now, there are disadvantages to procedures as well. For example, they're far too rigid. There's things in the business sometimes that you can't follow the procedure or just have to get this done. And a procedure might be so rigid that it does not respond to unique business circumstances. In that way, instead of being a benchmark, it's just seen as an inflexible hindrance that it gets in the way quite often of real business activity. A procedure might mandate we go through a number of different steps, which could be seen to be rather inefficient. We all know that if you want to do anything on your car, usually the first step in the procedure is disconnect the battery. Very few of us, if we're going to change the oil, are going to follow that procedure exactly. We would consider that disconnecting the battery before changing the oil would be a rather inefficient and unnecessary step. But that's one of the problems. If we follow the procedures every time, it would probably be a little bit safer, but on the other hand, less efficient. The thing is that procedures in that way are not always responsive to local requirements, to local needs. We also can implement the intent of policy through standards. Now, standards could be based on a framework such as the ISO 27001. Now, ISO 27001 is a standard. It's an international standard of security requirements. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a standard for my company. It only becomes a standard for my company if my company says, you know, we're going to base our security program on this framework. Everything we do must be compliant with that. It has become the standard against which we measure our activity. Now, standards could be hardware. We quite often see this where, well, we, for example, are a Cisco shop, or we use all of our equipment we purchase from this one vendor. There's some really good advantages when it comes to interoperability and scalability when we follow hardware standards. We can do the same thing with software. We're Microsoft. Or maybe everyone in our company is given a Mac. That idea of having an approved software can have some real advantages as well. So some of those advantages would be, well, if you buy everything in bulk, you probably get a better price than buying it individually. It's a lot easier to train our administrators and users on one type of system than on multiple types of systems. We don't have to worry about interoperability because all of the equipment is from the same vendor. It will communicate, hopefully, with the other equipment. But there are some real disadvantages here too. You end up now with maybe increased expense because, yes, it was cheaper when you bought it, but now the ongoing licensing fees, the ongoing maintenance fees might be extraordinary. We also end up with this problem of vendor lock-in. Now it can be incredibly expensive to get away from that product so that it quite simply has a lock that does not allow us to be able to use other products. The other thing is that when I buy a product that is designed as a commercially available off-the-shelf system, then I'm getting something that is good for the general sense of everybody, but not necessarily customized for my business. The other thing is that a lot of products today were at one point unique niche products. We had a really good product for anti-spam, another really good one for antivirus, another really good one for monitoring. What do we have today? We have one company that's bought up all of those other companies. Now they build it into their one product does all type of solution, which sometimes is wonderful. Other times gives you that worry that now we have 7 or 8 products that on their own were great, but combined are not nearly as effective as they used to be. Are there advantages? Absolutely. You buy and maintain one product. Much easier for administrators. Are there disadvantages? Sure. Because what happens if that vendor has a breach? Now that vulnerability is on all of my systems. We could also implement policy through baselines. Now, baselines are usually considered to be the minimum set of acceptable practices. Now, that does not mean the minimum set of possible practices. No, the minimum set of acceptable practices. If you want to connect to our network, you have to meet this minimum set of requirements. Your product must have an up-to-date antivirus system, must have its patches up to date, and maybe our network access control system enforces that. So it checks the configuration of a device to make sure that device is correctly configured. Even something like a virtual machine. Was it configured correctly to prevent a breach of that implementation? So in many cases, a baseline is implementation specific. It says this is the baseline for how a system or device must be configured or set up. We also try to make sure we have logs, so we're able to check for changes to the baseline or suspicious behavior. And in this way, it describes what is acceptable for us, so we know that everything must meet at least that minimum standard. Now, you don't aim for the minimum. Your department may go far beyond the required baseline, but you also know that nobody will connect to our network who doesn't at least meet that minimum baseline. We also provide suggestions or recommendations. These are often known as guidelines. Now, the difference is, of course, that policies, procedures, standards, and baselines were all mandated requirements that the organization's personnel had to follow. When it comes to guidelines, we're turning around and saying, here's a good way to choose a password. We're maybe not enforcing it, but it's advice on how to comply with good security practices. And in this way, it's usually not mandatory. It's quite simply, we can say here, a recommendation that is given to the user. The key points to review here, of course, is that policies are the foundation. But the implementation of the intent of policy comes through the use of procedures, baselines, and standards. These are tools that support the objective of the policy. We also have recommendations that could help us to interpret then the intention of policy as well.